suppose as this is a railroad presentation, we should probably go ahead and depart on schedule, so we'll go ahead and start. My name is Rick Kfoury. I am the newsletter editor and one of the directors for the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. I work along with my friend James in the back. You might have seen him selling books. We're involved with preserving the history of the Boston and Maine Railroad, which, as I'm sure many of you know, was the predominant railroad corporation in New England, at least northern New England, in the time period we're speaking of today. And I do see some familiar faces here, so I'm glad to see everybody. And for those that I haven't met yet, I appreciate you coming by to learn about this stuff. And of course, thank you to the Manchester Historical Association for hosting today. So Manchester is an interesting subject. Lots of people know about Manchester, their historical past from the 1800s. Many people are familiar with the Amoskeag Mills, the Amoskeag Locomotive Works, sort of the days when Manchester was an industrial powerhouse that everybody was familiar with. But one thing about Manchester that not a lot of people are familiar with is the fact that it was a railroad city until very recently, and that's what we're going to try to talk to you about today. I have John here.
But first, allow me to do the introductions. Yeah, my name is John Clayton. I'm the executive director of the Manchester Historic Association and this, our Millyard Museum. I want to welcome you today for Rick's talk about Queen City Rails. How many of you are here for the first time? Raise your hand. Okay, you can never say that again, right? You're here, I got you. We own you now. Those of you who paid $8 for admission today, shame on you. If you were a member, you could have saved $2 and put that toward a membership for next year. Memberships begin as low as $25 for seniors. We don't have any seniors here, never mind. But $30 for general membership entitles you to free admission for the year, including great programs like Rick's talk today. Now, how many of you have been stopped by the railroad crossings on Canal Street at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon? Raise your hands. Yeah, we all love the railroads on that day, don't we? We're going to change that mindset right now because Rick is going to tell you the fascinating story from 1965 to 1990. Now that coincides with the beginning of urban renewal here in the Millyard. A number of rail yards were taken out because of that, but we still have that one spur that goes through here, so it's still a part of our history every day. And that's what we celebrate here at the Millyard Museum. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rick Kfoury. Now you're official.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, absolutely. So, as we spoke about, Manchester in that time period, which, you know, when you look at it half a lifetime ago, it's really not all that long. It really turned into a modern city of today where the railroad, unfortunately, did not follow in that importance. And there's quite a few reasons for that. We'll go over a little bit about that today. Maybe we got some technical difficulties here.
Just like the railroad.
Right, there you go. Yeah, you always got to be ready for this kind of stuff. All right, let's go.
Always on time.
Yeah. Right, on time. James, if you wouldn't mind coming and be my assistant engineer here, I'd appreciate it. Yeah, so as we can see here, this picture was taken 1978, and it's taken obviously looking along Canal Street.
Posted up front of this.
Yeah. Yeah, looking north towards Concord. What we see here is one of the local freights, and we'll go over what that means in a bit. But this is an interesting photo because it shows the Boston and Maine's relevance in connection to the city of Manchester as a whole. And the interesting thing to note here is that long brick building was actually the Amoskeag Locomotive Works, which was Manchester's claim to fame when it comes to the railroad. So you have the railroad, you have the locomotive works, and the skyline of Manchester just showing you, you know, in a sense, how important the railroad was to Manchester even as the city started to modernize. Just, you're going to have to lean down there and push the space. It's over here. It's in front. There you go. I'll give you the signal. You can go ahead. Space bar. There you go. Hit it again. Here's another shot that I like quite a bit. This was taken in 1973 of the Goffstown branch local crossing the Merrimack River coming into Manchester Yard. And the reason I love this photo so much is it shows Manchester's historical past coming in contact with its current present, as you see the new buildings there and the railroad, which at this point was still hauling gas to Grasmere and was taking products out of a company called New Hampshire which was located in Goffstown. And as you know, this is probably now the Riverway Walk, which you can cross the river on this bridge. It's no longer a railroad line, unfortunately. So Manchester in 1967, this is a little bit after our start date, was a very different city than it is today. And you can see that in these aerial photos, which were taken by the Historical Building Survey for the government. And you can see the railroad station right here, down in the bottom right. And this long line coming through the city was the Northern Main Line, which was also called the New Hampshire Division Main Line, which started in North Chelmsford and ran all the way up through White River Junction, Vermont. And this was the main artery for freight traffic and passenger traffic through the city of Manchester. It was a double-track main line through the city, and coming off of the main line were a few spur lines which ran through the Millyard, as you can see right about here. So the city, as a railroad city, was quite different than it is today, and also one of the biggest things you can notice about this picture is the canal which ran through the city. Actually, there were two of them. And those were also a testament to Manchester's historical past, although at this time it didn't really serve a purpose anymore, as the Millyard had been pardoned off to individual corporations at this point. It wasn't a manufacturing corporation as a whole as it had been previously. Another shot which shows the Millyard around the same time period. You can see the double-tracked main line and a spur that comes off here. And this would all change in the 70s, as John related to, speaking about urban renewal, and that's something we'll talk about as well. But it shows you the close proximity, the intimate proximity of the railroad to the city of Manchester. And that's one of the big themes here today, is just how connected the city was to railroads. You could literally go to any part of the city and see trains operating, and that's not something you can do today.
Is that Canal Street on the right?
Yes, that was Canal Street at the time, and it was expanded during the renewal project. Now this is the renewal we're talking about here. This is in 1974, I believe, they went ahead and filled in the canal. They had filled in the canals previously. And what they did is they relocated the railroad, which previously ran here as a double-track main line. They relocated it on top of where the canal was and made it a single-track main line. And what they did is they built a road on top of where the railroad used to be, and that's why Canal Street is two roads now going in either direction. Now, this unfortunately speaks to the decline of the railroad's traffic going through the city of Manchester. Double-track main line is more useful when you have lots of trains running, because you can run trains in different directions. Single-track main lines, not so much. So the fact that the B&M decided to go ahead and relocate and then rebuild as a single line shows that the traffic volume was decreasing at this point. And you can see here a picture of the construction. They've regraded and reballasted the new line, and they've installed new crossing protection. And this is the old main line that was still in service while they were building the new one. But pretty soon it would be taken out of service and pulled up and replaced with Canal Street. Another interesting shot that shows the north end of the Millyard with the canals where they diverged. And there's actually a spur line that ran up the length of the lower Millyard and terminated just about where Eversource is. And that was called the Lower Canal Track. And that was in service until the late 70s. And it actually ran right up the length of the Millyard, right through the parking lots that you would see today. So when they came through with the switcher locomotives, they usually had to tell people to move their cars. And there were quite a few customers in the lower Millyard. One of them was Habitant Soup, which made pea soup and other things and shipped them out in carloads.
I got a question on that.
Yeah.
The dam that went off to the right, is that still there, or did they take that out?
Can you go back for a second with the arrow keys?
See the dam on the right where the canal starts?
That is still there. Yeah, and actually a little bit of the upper canal is still in to about right here. And that's, I think, a spillway for the Muskeg Dam, I believe. And this is another neat shot which shows the area of Granite Street and South Commercial Street. And this was the little station right here. We'll talk about the replacement, because that was originally a much larger, much grander station. And you can see a spur line here which came off of the main line and crossed, I believe this is West Auburn Street, and ran up into Hermsdorf Fixtures, which was a big company for the railroad. There was another spur line which came through the parking lot down here, which today would be Market Basket, ran right through the parking lot, crossed West Auburn Street, and came into the buildings over here. And then there was another siding which came off, oh, this is the canal siding right down here, which ran across Granite Street right here and ran up into the Millyard. So there were sidings everywhere in Manchester, running into buildings, through sidings, through parking lots, through alleyways. It was a very a very busy city when it came to the railroad. And here's an interesting shot. This was taken by a gentleman who's actually here today in 1966, and this is running through the Millyard on the main line, and you can see the canal to the right, and this is taken in the cab of a Boston and Maine GP7 on the local freight, which ran from Concord to Portsmouth, over the Portsmouth branch, which ran through East Manchester. Another neat shot, or two more neat shots rather, that show the canal right here, and then another shot entering Manchester Yard, and you can see the switch here is lined for the Portsmouth branch, which diverged from the main line. Actually, it was the Manchester and Lawrence branch, and it went under Elm Street, and then the Portsmouth branch would have broken away and then ran up through East Manchester. So you could just see here so much of what's gone today and how connected everything was at that point in time, and just the level of activity which you can't see today. Now here's an unbelievable photo, which I actually picked up the other day, and it was a negative that had nothing to do with the railroad, but interestingly enough, when I saw what was in the background, I just about lost my mind, because that was the original Manchester station. It actually wasn't the original, it was the third that they had built, but this is the one that people tend to remember the most. It was a lovely building. It was right off at the corner of Granite Street and West Auburn Street, and you can see this is Granite Street in the foreground, and it looks like somebody's being stopped here for traffic. Apparently a Marlon Brando impersonator. But you can see in the background 3 Bud cars, which Bud cars were self-propelled passenger coaches, which was the mainstay of the passenger fleet for the Boston and Maine. And they're getting ready to depart. And in the middle you can see a Canadian Pacific Bud car, which would have been on the run-through train from Boston to Montreal. So this is a Montreal-bound train in Manchester, if you can imagine that. And this is what they replaced it with. When they tore down Manchester Union Station in 1962, the Boston Maine was losing its shirt on passenger service thanks to the highways, which were becoming more prevalent in air traffic as well. So they elected to build a smaller, more appropriate station for the traffic level, and that's what they came away with. And unfortunately, even this is gone today, so it's not something that we're able to enjoy. Oh, hit it again. Yeah, one more time. And that shows you just about where the station was in relation to everything else. Yep. Here's another interesting shot that shows a northbound passenger train heading to Concord. So in 1965, the Boston and Maine discontinued through passenger service to Montreal. It just wasn't viable. There wasn't enough passengers. And they cut the service back to Concord. So post-1965, you could only take a train as far as Concord. And this is one of those trains heading north. And if you look up into the top, you can see the Frederick Smith Mansion, which was an absolutely beautiful Gothic mansion, which had been built by an industrial pioneer. He was actually a railroad man and was a politician as well. And that building is currently the site of the Brady Sullivan Tower. They demolished it not soon after this picture was taken and replaced it with what would be the Brady Sullivan Tower. And if you look over here, you can see the Armory building. So this whole area has completely changed. And one of the things you'll notice as this presentation goes along is that as the railroad changes, the city of Manchester changes as well. And those two changes kind of went hand in hand, which is interesting to note. And here we see a Montreal-bound passenger train. This is one of the very last trains to go to Montreal, Canadian Pacific equipment, getting ready to depart Manchester Station. I believe this picture was taken in 1965, January 3rd, 1965, which was just about when they stopped running. Now, after they discontinued the regular passenger service, there was quite a few unusual passenger happenings that happened in Manchester. In 1973, they ran quite a few passenger excursions up to Weirs Beach, which were sponsored by the city of Manchester, the mayor's office. And they were senior citizens outings, and they boarded at the former Manchester passenger station, which had been turned into a rental car building at this point in time after passenger service ended. And they would have run up to Weirs Beach on the White Mountain branch out of Concord. And this was sort of a perk that the city of Manchester and the Boston and Maine cooperated on. And another shot of, I believe this is the same train actually, heading north, taken from the old wooden bridge that used to be up near Amoskeag Falls. And you can see the urban renewal starting to take place. They filled in the canal and they're getting ready to relocate the main line. Another thing that happened that was rather interesting for passengers was the American Freedom Train, which came into Manchester in 1975. This was a national initiative, which was an organization that put together, they pulled a steam engine, I believe it was an ex-Reading Railroad steam engine, and quite a few passenger coaches, which were filled with artifacts from America's past, various documents. I believe they had reproductions of the Declaration of Independence, that sort of thing. And it was a museum train that came to town. It came down from White River Junction on the northern line into Concord, and then came down from Concord to Manchester. And they parked it right on the main line, and they had it open for, I believe, 2 days in 1975 for people to come and walk through and just kind of get a feel for what it was. Very popular, as you can see. And I believe this was the last time a steam engine ever ran through the city of Manchester. Yep. Another rare excursion that happened in 1973, which you can see here, this is coming north from Queen City, the Queen City Bridge, was a steam excursion that was sponsored by Steamtown, which was a railroad museum out in Vermont. And they took a nickel plate railroad steam locomotive and some passenger coaches, and they ran them from Boston to White River Junction up the northern line. And you can see them coming through here, South Manchester. And I believe this was Foster Grant on the left, which was a very high-profile business for the railroad. It had originally been McElwain's Shoe, I believe, and it had been replaced by Foster Grant at this point. But as you can see, lots of boxcars there, big customer for the railroad. Now everybody likes to talk about the return of the MBTA, well, not the return of the MBTA, but the return of passenger service to Manchester. And this was taking place in 1980. And how this happened was, this was sponsored by the federal government. It was grant money that came from the government just to test the possibility of returning passenger service to central New Hampshire from Boston to Concord. And it began in 1980. And actually, they ran test trains in 1979 to make sure the line was capable of handling passenger traffic. And the run itself lasted from January 28th, 1980 until February 20th, 1981. So a little bit over a year they were running passenger trains from Boston to Concord. And you can see the schedule here. You probably can't read it too well, but unfortunately one of the problems that this had was the schedule was not suited to commuters' needs. And that was one of the flaws with the return of passenger rail. You can see here one of the test runs. I believe this is actually the test run on May 3rd, 1979. This is coming, I think this is heading north, I believe.
South.
Yeah, oh, the headlight, yep, this is heading south, yep. F10, which is a MBTA locomotive, and some passenger coaches coming south at Amoskeag. And you can see the main line here has already been moved over, and this is the single track main line here. Yep, go ahead. And occasionally, the passenger commuter runs had Boston and Maine equipment on them. And this was done because the Boston and Maine had a lease agreement with the MBTA to lease them passenger equipment. So they leased them GP7 locomotives, which were originally freight locomotives, well, they were originally passenger locomotives, and they had been recently used for freight service. But the MBTA put them back into passenger service, powering the MBTA passenger trains for a brief period of time. And you can see this is the replacement station that they came up with once they had sold the original station to that rental car service. On the north end of Granite Street, they literally just laid down some gravel and had a sign. And that was the passenger stop in 1980. And unfortunately, this is another reason why the trial didn't work out well, is because they didn't put the time to build the facilities. And I believe it's because it was just a trial period. I mean, why would you build a station if you're not expecting to carry out the full trial? But yeah, very sparse, as you can see. Another thing that they tried was experimenting with British rail buses, which had been suggested as possible commuter alternatives for the United States. So they ran these rail buses between Lowell, I believe, and Concord. They didn't go all the way into Boston with these. They weren't allowed to. But they were rudimentary at best. They were not comfortable to ride in. They were not well suited for passenger service. But the MBTA just basically wanted to test them out. So they stuck them on this trial period for Manchester, and they just said, have at it. We'll see if it works. And it wasn't successful, unfortunately. And one of the biggest things that people associate those rail buses with is the unfortunate accident that took place when at South Mitchell Street, they hit a car at the crossing, and unfortunately there were 2 casualties. I'm not sure what happened to the 3rd person that was injured, but pretty soon they realized that these things just didn't have the presence of a train. People did not notice them as much as they would a full train, and they took them out of service. And I believe this is still existing. I believe it's at the Connecticut Trolley Museum. It's still around, but it's sitting in the woods. They haven't done anything with it. A couple more images from the passenger trial here. You can see equipment going through the city. The F-10s weren't used as much as the F-40s, which was the newest passenger equipment that the MBTA had. But they did make an appearance from time to time in Manchester. And unfortunately, like I said, the commuter rail trial, it didn't work out. The funding ran out, and they pretty much ended the service. But one thing that they did find was that the ridership numbers were very promising. There were a lot of people that not only were interested in using the service, but there were a lot of people that went ahead and used the service. But just the planning wasn't done well, the infrastructure wasn't done well, and there were also no track improvements done before the service, and that affected the speeds at which the trains could travel. So it was a good idea, but it wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Another shot coming through the yard here. So Manchester Yard, though, when we talk about Manchester in the period of 1965 to 1990, we're not really talking about passenger trains, because passenger service to Manchester in general ended in 1967. So most of the time we're talking about the freight business, which the railroad business was the freight business in that period of time. And Manchester Yard was the lifeblood of the railroad in Manchester. And I'll read to you a little excerpt that was published in a railroad magazine in 1977, which describes Manchester Yard. They actually did an article on how to model Manchester Yard. And you can see the title, A Yard is a Yard, or Is It? Is pretty interesting, because Manchester Yard at this point in time was still very active and very busy, but there was a visible decline happening. So we'll read the excerpt here. Manchester is strictly Boston and Maine territory, with lines radiating out in all directions. North to White River Junction, and an interchange with the Central Vermont in White River Junction. South to Boston, a branch line west to Goffstown, and 2 lines east, one to Portsmouth, the other to Lawrence, Massachusetts. And right in the middle of all of this is Manchester Yard. Shaped like a kidney, if they can shape swimming pools like a kidney, there's no reason a railroad yard couldn't be. It is obvious that Manchester had a more important role in the B&M's better days. The engine house is gone, a liberal quantity of weeds abound, and all the buildings, mostly smaller frame affairs, plus this 2-story former tower, sorely needed a couple of coats of paint. The locomotive area is down to a couple of tracks, and that is all stationed here now are a few yard switchers, one of which works the Goffstown line. The day we visited, a pair of assigned switchers badly needed a new coat of paint, as well as badly as the buildings. So Manchester, in this period of time, was starting to decline, but the thing you can notice about the city and the railroad yard is that it's far busier and far larger than anything we have today. Now, the 2 structures we see here were the lifeblood of Manchester Yard, which was the lifeblood of the railroad in Manchester. This building here is called MA Tower. It was built as a control tower for the signaling system and had originally controlled the signals from Nashua to Concord, as well as the automatic switches in the yard. They closed this building in the early 1970s as the signal system was transferred to Billerica, Massachusetts, so they no longer controlled the signals out of Manchester, but it still did serve a purpose for storage for the signal department. The other building you see here was more important, at least in this period of time. This was the yard office, and this was the headquarters for the yardmaster, which at this point in time was Arthur Lynch, very important man in the railroad scene in Manchester, as well as the headquarters for all the freight agents and yard clerks, which handled all the customers in Manchester, all the business accounts, basically did all the paperwork. Now this is taken inside the brick tower, MA Tower, And this shows the signal system when it was still controlled out of Manchester. You can see the wings of the control system here showing all the switches, all the interlockings from Nashua to Concord. And this gentleman here is working the control panel, as well as communicating with train crews over the phone. And this building is the yard office tower, which, as you can see, was a two-level wooden building. And I believe it had a TV antenna somewhere, so they were watching TV. But you can see the sign for Arthur Lynch, the yard master. And this was a very important building for the railroad. This was basically where all the operations would have been controlled out of. And of course, in the background, Sandal Auto Parts, which was fairly important. And some interesting character shots. That's Arthur Lynch, the yard master, on the phone at work. I believe he passed away maybe 8 or 9 years ago, but he was a very important man for Manchester. He worked in Manchester for a very, very long period of time. And right here, you can see that's him kneeling with some of his friends, some of his buddies from the yard office. All of these guys would have had important jobs in Manchester. All of these guys were employed by the railroad. They all had a purpose. They all had a job to do. They all did it well. They all knew what they were doing. And unfortunately, by the time we get to the end of this presentation, all of these job positions would have been eliminated in Manchester. Some more shots of the yard. A little signal shanty here, or actually probably a maintenance away shed for supplies and that sort of thing. I believe this is a water pump for the engines in the engine facility. And this is a phone box. You saw these all over the Boston and Maine. These were very prevalent. This is how train crews would have communicated with the operations in the yard tower. So they would have opened the box, had a phone, they could have called up the yard tower and told them what their plans were and got their paperwork and that sort of thing. It was the main communication line between the train crews and the operations department. Another interesting shot here, we could see Manchester Yard. This was the engine service facility. This is currently the outfield of the ball field in Manchester. And it was a two-track business here. 2 tracks for engines to be parked, refueled, resanded, to get their water for their radiators. And this building here was a remnant of the roundhouse, which had been torn down in the early 50s, or the early 60s, I believe. And this was used to house equipment for the engines, sand for the engines to keep it dry, that sort of thing. But very sparse engine facility, as you can see, but it served a purpose. It did what it needed to do, and it was very important for the railroad. Now, the thing about Manchester that we need to address is just how busy the traffic was. And Manchester Yard had no less than 4 switcher jobs handling the business at any given time. Go ahead, James. They were controlled by guys like this, engineers. The switchers were often smaller switcher locomotives that were built for the Boston and Maine. You can see some of them here. The first switcher job was the East Side job and would have handled the customers in East Manchester on the Portsmouth branch. The Portsmouth branch within the city was the domain of a switcher crew. So they would have gone out as far as Page Street in East Manchester and handled all the customers in that vicinity. The second switcher job handled Manchester Yard, so they switched the yard tracks, broke down trains that were coming in, built up trains that would be going out, did that sort of thing. And they also handled the nearby customers to the yard. The third trick switcher handled Canal Street, Franklin Street, the Lower Millyard, Elm Street, and also went down the Manchester and Lawrence branch as far as Gold Street at night to handle Associated Grocers, which was down by 293. And then there was the second trick switcher, which handled the west side. They would have done the track which ran along 293 on the west side, and that was preferably done during daylight as there was a lot of traffic in that area. And they did do a little bit of street running where they ran down the middle of the road, so they wanted to make sure that they didn't hit any cars that were operating in that period of time. And here we see an example of a switcher locomotive that would have been used probably on the third trick switcher, which ran down the Manchester and Lawrence branch as far as Gold Street. This is an SW8, 800 horsepower Boston and Maine switcher locomotive. These were very well liked by the switch crews in Manchester. They could pull just about anything that you needed to pull during that period of time. And on the right, we can see an SW1, which is a smaller locomotive, which would have been preferred by the east side switcher and the west side switcher because it had a smaller wheelbase, so it could handle the tight curves going in and out of the customers. Very sturdy locomotive, very popular. I believe on the left that's in NW2, which was not as common in Manchester, but did show up from time to time. But these were the type of engines you would have seen running along Valley Street. You would have seen running out the west side and that sort of thing. Very common to see in Manchester. And they always had switch crews of 4 or 5 guys. And they all worked in cooperation. They had overtime. These were seniority positions. So these were regular jobs that were very sought after, mostly handled by the veteran guys that did the job. But they did their job and they did it well. And they did it every day of the week. Every single day of the week they did this job. Good shot here of Manchester Yard looking south. And Manchester Yard was really 2 yards. You had the Woods Yard, which was located on the west side of the yard in the background here, and that was 3 or 4 tracks which handled incoming and outbound freight. And on the west side, or east side of the yard rather, you had the Ledges Yard, which was called that because it was right next to the ledges that led up to Elm Street, in the area just about behind where the bus facilities would be in Manchester. And that was a 5-track yard, very busy. A lot of freight cars in there in that yard at a given time. Very high volume.
So is that the Goffstown spur?
Yes, this is the Goffstown branch here, which swung out of the yard and went across the river over that bridge we saw in the beginning of the presentation. And that was handled by a local freight. That was not handled by a switcher. We'll go over that when we get to the Goffstown branch. And then you can see a track here. This track right here is the canal track, which would have gone through the lower Millyard, and that broke off of the Goffstown branch. But as the 1970s progressed, as you can see, that became less and less used, and eventually they just used it for car storage. They didn't use it for freight traffic. Another interesting thing about Manchester Yard was the piggyback yard. Now, piggyback refers to trailers being piggybacked on top of flat cars. It was a way for the railroads to sort of work with the highway system and kind of get business they would have lost out on originally. And what these companies would do is these trucking companies would contract with the railroad. They would come down to the yard, place their piggybacks onto the flat cars, and then the railroad would move them from one location to another. Then they would be offloaded and they would have been moved by truck to where they were going.
That's how the circus used to come to town?
Exactly, and we'll go with a couple pictures here. You want to go? They were loaded circus style, actually. And the piggyback facility was described as not the biggest on the B&M, but the best on the B&M. It was a very efficient operation. These guys worked like clockwork. They had this thing down to a science. I read an account of how they did it, and they literally had one guy go by and do something, and they had the next guy go by and do something, lower the pins, crank down the pylons, lower the cars, and then, go ahead. They backed the tractor trailer right up onto the flat car, hooked up the tractor trailer, and then pulled it right off onto a ramp. And you can see some of the trucks. These are actually Manchester Motor Freight. Yeah, there you go. Trucks. You can go back for a second. That was one of the firms in Manchester that did a lot of piggyback business with the railroad. So as you can see, yeah, and they still do. Although unfortunately not in Manchester. This was a way that the railroad connected to the local companies. The railroad was relied upon even by trucking companies, which, if you could believe that nowadays, that's still something that happens, but people don't often associate that with the railroad. And this is how they would have done it with a circus-style ramp. And I believe New Hampshire Shippers Co-op had the contract to do this. The B&M originally had their own trucking department, but that went bankrupt. So they contracted out with a local company to do the unloading and the loading of the flat cars. And this is another shot of Manchester Yard. This is the Woods Yard, but this is taken from the cab of a switcher locomotive going into the Woods Yard. And I believe this photo was taken by Barry Sandel, which is the same family that owned the auto parts store. And he was given the chance to ride along with a switcher crew in 1976. And that's something you could do back then. You could just show up to the yard if you were a rail fan, and you could meet the guys, these grizzled veterans, these French-Canadian guys, and they'd let you ride on the train, and sometimes they'd let you run the train, and they would give you an education, and they would show you how the railroad worked, and they would show you the connection that the railroad had to the city. And these guys were Manchester natives. They'd lived there their whole life. They had worked on the railroad their whole life, and that's gone today. We don't have that anymore in Manchester, which is a shame. Go ahead and hit it again. So the first branch we're going to talk about is the Goffstown branch. The Goffstown branch was the shortest of all the Manchester-based branches. It was only 8 miles long. Originally, it had gone to North Ware and then on up to Henniker, but the 38 flood had other plans, or the 38 hurricane rather had other plans, and they cut it back to Goffstown. It had the fewest amount of customers of any Manchester branch. It only had 4 at this point: Home Gas at Grasmere, New Hampshire Door in Goffstown, Kendall Hadley Lumber in Goffstown, and Merrimack Farmers in Goffstown. At this point in time, the track conditions were getting pretty poor, so it was handled at very slow speeds. But of all the Manchester branches, it probably had the most beautiful scenery. It was a countryside branch. It crossed some very beautiful bridges, and it was handled by local jobs, which was mostly based out of Concord. The Concord crew would come down from Concord, do their work in Manchester Yard, then go out onto the Goffstown branch and handle the customers out there. Now, the Goffstown branch, probably its most recognizable feature, well, one of them anyway, was the bridge which crossed the Merrimack River. We can see a fairly typical outgoing freight at this point in time. Got a GP9 locomotive on the head, boxcar for probably that's probably for New Hampshire Door, tanker of propane gas for Home Gas, and boxcar for Kendall Hadley, and this is probably also for Kendall Hadley. It doesn't look like they have any grain cars on this day. Now this is an interesting shot of a train going back into Manchester Yard with the GP7 on the head, and these cars are not from a scrap dealership. This scrap metal came from somewhere on the Goffstown Bridge. Does anybody have a guess as where this might have come from? When they demolished the old Kelly's Falls Bridge, they took a lot of the scrap out by rail, and they took it by the B&M. The Goffstown branch passed right underneath the bridge, right about here, and they loaded up the gondola cars and brought it back into Manchester Yard. And that bridge, by the way, was very unique because it had a very unexpected turn. And I believe there were quite a few traffic accidents that were associated with that.
There weren't many in the country either, was there?
No, it was very unique. Yeah, that was a unique case right there. Probably the most unique and beautiful location on the branch was Kelly's Falls. This was taken from that bridge, and it was an absolutely gorgeous pile trestle which crossed right above the falls. And this was an old, I believe, hydroelectric or maybe coal-fired power plant. Hydro, yep. And I believe it was originally part of the power plant for the trolley system. But you can see a very small, the Goffstown freights were small, they were not large. They were very modest. But you can see the train crossing the falls, and this was a very popular swimming hole for kids. And I believe there was a myth that there was some wreckage below the bridge. On the north side, and that if you jumped in and you hit the wreckage, you'd be in back. But there was never a wreck there, so that was just a legend.
It was the old.
It might have been part of the
frame
covered bridge,
bridge,
though. Yeah, because there was a covered bridge there at some point that burned down.
That's what we were told.
Yeah, so it could have been that. I wouldn't be surprised.
You learn to dive off it, like climbing
Yeah.
blocks every year. You got older, you finally got up to the trestle and jump.
Yep, and it's funny because this bridge was here until 2015, even though the railroad was gone in 1981. And I went there to take pictures of it right before it was torn down, and there were kids still jumping off of it. So it was something that had transcended generations, even though the railroad had not. Okay, you can go ahead. Now, another interesting thing about the Goffstown branch was Magoo's Drive-In, which was in Grasmere, and still is, and it's still open. There's a little dining spot, and their tracks ran right behind it, and the local crew would stop for lunch just about every time they ran the branch, and they would have their lunch. And you can see the Goffstown branch crew right here. I believe one of these guys, Morris Foote, was a regular on the Goffstown branch. And I believe that's him right there. And that was part of the daily life. They would stop and they would talk to the guys and have their lunch. And, it just shows you how connected the railroad was to everyday life. And, you don't see this type of thing anymore. You really don't, especially in communities like Goffstown. It's just not there anymore. Now, the first customer, not the first customer, but the first high-profile customer was New Hampshire Doors. It was located just before the covered bridge in Goffstown, and as you can see, the siding is here, and that's an SW1. You've got the brakeman getting ready to flag the crossing, coming into town, and I believe they were in business until 1980, and when they went out of business, that was one of the major reasons that the Boston and Maine decided to give up on the branch. One of the other customers was in Goffstown Village on the other side of the covered bridge, so the covered bridge would have been back behind out of view here, and the station would have been right about here as well. It still is. It's a coffee shop now. And got a car for Kendall Hadley and some cars for Merrimack Farmers Exchange. They were all located on the same siding. And GP7, local crew, talking to the guys from the lumber crew here. Just a very intimate operation. You can't picture it now if you go to Goffstown, but this happened quite a lot.
What's the pipe over?
I would have to guess that would be for sawdust or something of the sort.
Sit on the ground?
Yeah. Not a railroad business, but they probably shipped it out by truck.
That was the water feed for steam engines.
Oh, okay. That would make sense too. Yep, steam engines ran the branch until 1954, I believe. And then they were replaced by diesel, so that would make a lot of sense as well. And this is looking in the other direction. That's the Kendall Hadley complex here. Got a GP9 getting ready to head back to Manchester with some freight. That's the long siding here that ran to Merrimack Farmers Exchange. And this is a wonderful photo because you've got the railroad, you've got the town in the background, a couple kids. Looks like this one might be a future rail fan, just a guess. And the Goffstown station, which thankfully is still there. Like I said, it's a coffee shop, and they've done a nice job to preserve it. But this was just something you saw in towns like Goffstown back in that period of time. Now, the most famous aspect, I've said a couple things about being famous. This was the most famous, was the covered bridge. At this point in time, it was the last active covered bridge on the Boston and Maine Railroad. It wasn't the last active Boston and Maine covered bridge, but it was the last active Boston and Maine covered bridge on the B&M system. The other ones were on other railroads that had taken over B&M lines. This covered bridge was absolutely beloved by the town of Goffstown. It was an icon. It was something that the people were just in love with. And as you can see, it was very beautiful. It spoke to an earlier time in railroading. It spoke to a time when bridges were built differently, when the railroad was, a more high-profile industry in these small towns. And it was still in service up into the diesel era, right until the end of 1976, when unfortunately it suffered a rather catastrophic fire. You can go ahead. But this is, a beautiful testament to the bridge, and also the men that worked the branch. Now, August 16th, 1976, the bridge went up in flames. Now, there are a lot of different theories about how this happened. Some people say it was a well-known arsonist that was seen in the area. Some people say it was some school kids. But nonetheless, the bridge went up in flames. And there was a man working the Goffstown Merrimack Farmers Exchange that day. And one of the customers came running in, and the covered bridge is on fire. He couldn't believe it. And the guy grabbed him and pulled him outside, and sure enough, it was completely engulfed in flames. And it was determined that a small trash fire had been set in the center of the bridge. And of course, a bridge like this, which had seen diesel fumes and oil and smoke over the years, went up like that. And I believe the fire only lasted 20 minutes. And it was completely gone. Go ahead again. And it collapsed right into the river. Now, the Boston and Maine decided not to replace the bridge. The only two customers that were on the other side of the river, Merrimack Farmers Exchange and Kendall Hadley Lumber, were not high profile enough to warrant rebuilding the bridge. They did, I think, transload. They got their shipments in Manchester Yard and then trucked them into Goffstown. So they still did railroad business, just not directly with the railroad. And the covered bridge was never replaced, never repaired. The abutments are still there. You can go and see the stone abutments. And there's been some talk about possibly rebuilding it, but yeah, that was it. Now, one story that came out of the covered, everybody's got a story about the covered bridge in Goffstown. Everybody has a story about the fire. One of the most compelling stories about the covered bridge involves three boys who decided to save a piece of the covered bridge while it was burning. Now, these three boys, it's John Leonard, his brother, and their friend Chris. And the covered bridge, I'm quoting from the story, the covered bridge was used every day by walkers getting around town as an alternative to the regular road bridge. Sometimes twice a week a train would come through to the Farmers Exchange building or the lumber company. Young people used the bridge to go to school, church, going to the store, or just to visit, because it was very unique indeed. The bridge was a part of the town, just like the popcorn stand and all the quaint little town shops. When the alarm sounded at the fire station, word had spread from one end of the village to the other regarding the fire. I was working at the Grand Union as a store clerk. Within minutes, the store was empty as most people ran out to see what was going on. A few minutes later, I was running downtown past the town hall to the corner of Depot Street to see the fire. The heat was so intense, like a hot oven, that some of the paint on the fire trucks blistered. The bridge inside looked like a black hole vortex of flames and burning embers. At some point, I noticed the historic railroad sign mounted to the side of the bridge. It was a fantastic sign, I thought, and I was hoping that somehow the sign could be rescued before being consumed by the fire. The flames were soon all around it, and at times I could not see through the flames. It was just a matter of moments before it was consumed, and I could feel being crushed by defeat of rescuing the sign. At that moment, I saw my brother Doug and told him of my heroic plan of rescuing that sign when it fell off the bridge, and that I was going to need some help. He was with his buddy Chris. I knew I could not count on him sticking around, but at least if he saw the sign gone, we would know it was in the river. I noticed a board floating down the river. It could be the sign, and since I did not see anything else close to the sides, I decided to lock my eyes on it as it floated towards the dam. Meanwhile, the current was taking the board towards the dam in the south bank. I could see that some of the charred timbers and boards had hung up on the top of the dam. As the board approached the top of the dam through all the other floating boards, it crested the dam top and floated 1/3 of the way over and got hung up. I was pointing to the top of the dam, putting my head in my hands, and had my hands wrung out like a seesaw going back and forth. To someone going by, I must have looked like a fool. To Doug and Chris, who were running low on adventure, because as of yet they had no idea where to look or where they were looking for, to them, I was looking like I had pulled a practical joke. Up the river, there were more boards floating downstream. I thought maybe one of them will take the same course and knock the sign over the dam. My eyes were fixed from one place, and then this board just floated into my sight and pushed the sign right over the top. As it went over the dam, I lost sight, but as I was going and jumping and using more hand motions, they knew it was coming over the dam. It took about 5 minutes for them to fish the board out of the river, and I could see that they were excited about rescuing this board. That must be the historic sign, since I did not hear any yelling. The Goffstown News took a picture of the three of us with the sign, and then I told them we need to turn this sign over to the police. Well, Doug had it in his mind that it was now his sign, so he took it home. It was not long before the police called and came by the house to pick up the sign. Somehow Doug and Chris schemed a plan to get into the police station to borrow the sign for some other newspaper picture that they had wanted. For 2 nights, the railroad sign was in our home on Summer Street until the Goffstown police came and rescued the sign from my brother with a tip from the originator of this adventure. And that was the last time I saw the sign. But it's in my possession now, so this summer of 2004, I plan to visit the Goffstown Historical Society and show them the sign and hopefully some pictures of the fire. Now, after the covered bridge burned, the Boston and Maine still operated the Goffstown branch, but they only went as far as New Hampshire door just before the covered bridge. But things were getting pretty bleak at that point in time. The track conditions were deteriorating rather to a point where it was determined that it was no longer safe to ship propane gas by rail, so home gas was no longer to be a customer. So the only customer left on the entire branch was New Hampshire door, and they decided to close down in 1980. So you can see here, these shots were taken in 1980. This shot was taken, I believe, 3 months before the branch was officially abandoned. One of the last trains to cross the river, one of the last trains to run to Goffstown. And as you can tell, one car is really not worth running 8 miles for, and that was one of the reasons that they abandoned the branch.
What's the secondary bridge in the background, do you know?
Granite Street.
Oh, that's Granite?
Yep. Now, another interesting feature that was on the west side of the river in Manchester was the West Side Spur, and this was a long freight spur that started just past the river crossing, and diverged, ran down along the bank, and ran in very close proximity to 293 all the way up under the Notre Dame Bridge to the area of Amoskeag Falls. And this was an industrial branch. There was quite a few customers on the branch itself. And it was handled by one of the yard switchers, which would have come over the river, backed down and gone down and served the customers. And you can see just how close it was to the highway. Now, if you're going north up 293, just after you pass under the old railroad bridge, if you look to the right, you can see the embankment where the railroad would have swung down and ran along to the highway. And that's an SW1, one of the yard switcher crews coming back. This is, I believe, the last time they ran that branch. And one of the big customers was Romeo Shagnon, which is a building company. Ironically, this was the company that was contracted to tear down the Union Station in 1962. But they were a very big freight customer, as you can see, SW1 with a yard switcher crew. I believe they're spotting a car here for unload. And this is the West Side Spur here, and this was the Shagnon siding, which also continued on to a scrap dealer that was back behind here. And an aerial view from 67, you can see the Shagnon building. And you can see the scrapyard as well. But it just ran very close to the highway. And I believe when they extended the highway, they covered up where the right-of-way would have been. Because the highway now is a lot wider than it was back then. Another aerial shot, you can see the scrapyard. Interesting thing, if you look close enough, they're using a rail crane to load and unload scrap. And there's another customer over here, it looks like a feed dealer. Ray the Mover was a customer, and as was the Union Leader, which I believe used that building to store newsprint.
I think that was Eau Claire's transportation. My dad worked with a truck there.
Yep.
They were on
Most of this is gone.
They were on McGregor.
Yeah, this is, I believe, the memorial field is here now. So a lot of that's.
West.
Oh, is it? I'm sorry, west. Yeah, obviously west. Yeah, and there you can see the spur and some of the customers. So just a very, very intimate railroad operation to the city. Very close, very close proximity. You know, if you had worked in any of these companies, you would have seen trains every day of your life going to and from work. You know, how many times can you say you see a train, you know, in a week going through Manchester? But back then, it just was a part of life. Now, the Portsmouth branch, actually, go ahead and hit it again, James, is the yellow branch here. And this is the Manchester and Lawrence branch in the red. So the Portsmouth branch actually came off of the Manchester and Lawrence branch right after the Elm Street overpass and swung up through East Manchester. And one of the brakemen described this as having umpteenth crossings. This was a very urban stretch of railroad. There were a lot of crossings, quite a few accidents over the years. But this domain would have been handled by one of the yard switchers. And it also would have been handled by a local freight, which would have ran out to Portsmouth. But the local freight did not handle the customers in the city itself. They just ran right through. The yard switchers would have handled the customers in the city. There was also a spur line which came off of the branch and ran along Valley Street. And you can still see some traces of that today. This was the busiest of all the Manchester branches. There were the most customers. The first 2 miles were absolutely packed with customers. Sometimes they had to do this twice a day to serve the customers. But as you got out of the city, it got increasingly rural. This is 93 here. And as you headed out towards Massabesic, there really weren't any customers. It was very rural. And the local freights would have gone through Auburn, Candia, Raymond, and Epping, and then Newfields, and then they would have crossed the Portland Main Line and gone out to Portsmouth. But in the late 70s, most freights didn't go beyond Epping because there were no customers between Rockingham and Epping. So most of the local freights would have only gone as far as Epping in the 70s. And this is the diversion here. You can see this is the Elm Street overpass. The photographer is looking down the Manchester and Lawrence branch, which goes straight. And you can see the Portsmouth branch cut away and climb up the hill and then curve off. And that was where the two branches diverged. And here you can see local freight going to Epping, coming up the curve here. That's the Manchester and Lawrence branch, and this is the Portsmouth branch. Now, it's hard to imagine nowadays standing at Silver Street, but 30-car freight trains came through there once or twice a week. And this is one of those local freights coming back from Portsmouth. 2 engines, quite a few cars, and this would have come through Valley Street, this would have come through Page Street, this would have come through Silver Street. You know, standing in these parts of the city now, you don't even see the right-of-way because it's been covered up by parking lots in some places. But, you know, 30-car freight train coming through East Manchester. It's hard to believe, but it happened. And here you can see this is Valley Street, looking towards Manchester Yard. You can see the local freight. Now, by the late 70s, those 25-car freight trains, they started to drop down as the rail traffic started to decline. And the locals got shorter and shorter. And I believe they only have 1 car today for Epping. It's a Merrimack Farmers Exchange car, came out of Bow, where the Blue Seal plant is now, carrying bagged feed for Merrimack Farmers Exchange, and they ran from Bow to Manchester on the main line and jumped on the Portsmouth branch and ran another 17 miles, 18 miles to Epping. You know, so this was probably even further than that. I believe it was like 21 miles to Epping. So 1 car. I mean, not very profitable, but the railroad was doing it because the railroad, you know, these companies depended on the railroad. One of the big customers on Taylor Street was the Agway elevator, and they got bagged feed in boxcars and loose feed in covered hoppers. And sometimes they had to go up here 2-3 times a day. That's how busy this customer was, and that's gone now. Another shot, SW8, handling the industry on this day. Boxcars, and these blue B&M boxcars, these 40-foot boxcars, those were often in captive service. They would have gone from Agway to Bow, back and forth, just carrying feed. That's what they did. Another shot. Now this is late. This is a very late shot. This is taken in 1978. And this is the Agway here. That's Elliott Hospital on the hill. And this is looking east. And this is a local freight coming back from Raymond. And we can tell that because they've got a covered hopper here. And the only industry at this period of time that would have gotten covered hoppers was Rerig Pacific in Raymond. They got plastic pellets. And they've got a flat car here from R.C. Hazelton, which was a construction dealer, which was right next to the Goldenrod, that construction dealer. And they got a lot of stuff in by rail. But this is a local freight. And the funny thing about this picture is the locomotive. That's a GP40. In 1978, these were state-of-the-art locomotives. This was the cream of the crop for the Boston and Maine. And they're using it on a 5-mile-an-hour branch line. And you look at this picture and say, why the heck were they doing this? Well, the reason is because there was a road line, or mainline road freight that went to Concord, and it often had this newer power on it. And sometimes they would take the new engines off and give them to the Concord-based local crews to use as their power. So the Concord-based local, which went out to Raymond, on this day had a brand new engine for their power. And they used these on the Goffstown branch as well, which is pretty frightening.
Pretty heavy for those lines.
Very heavy. They said the rails dipped a little bit when they went over them. Now, everybody loves this photo because of Johnny's Islas, which was the famous bargain store there in East Manchester. And of course, on the other side, you'll see in a minute, is Mammoth Mills, another famous one. But we've got a Ford Bronco high rail truck crossing Terrytown Road, doing an inspection tour on the branch, and got a wigwag signal, which is an older type signal, which was very unique, and they were used to protect crossings, obviously. And go ahead and hit it again. And that's how they worked. And this is up at Conway Scenic. They've got one restored. It's not the same one, but they do have one. And there was one here, and there were a few on the Manchester and Lawrence branch as well. So they were in the area. You could go see them. This is all gone now. I believe there's a parking lot for the Elliott over here. Johnny's Isles is long gone. Another shot of the wigwag in operation. Local freight going to Epping with a boxcar of brick for W.S. Goodrich and a boxcar of feed for Merrimack Farmers Exchange. I mean, when you look at this, a boxcar of feed and a boxcar of brick, you know, it's unbelievable that the railroad did that, but they did every week. And there's Mammoth Mills. And they've got another GP40, so apparently they were taken careful on this day. But that's a hopper of plastic pellets, or empty hopper coming back from Raymond. And the wigwag, of course. Now, if you played your cards right and you went to the Goldenrod and you got your takeout, you could go sit by Massabesic and watch the freight go by. You could go sit by Massabesic and watch a freight train go by. How strange does that sound today? But you could do it. And this is the 2-engine local going to Portsmouth. This is earlier. This is in the mid-'60s. But you know, it's a walking trail now. But you could go sit and you could watch a freight train go by, and you know, that's just the connection. This is right before the Auburn border. But you could go see it. This is how close the railroad was. I mean, there was no part of the city you could go to and not see a train. And that's how close the B&M had ties to the city of Manchester. And this is looking in the other direction. And this pole right here was a flag stop for the old passenger station that was there at one point. And that was there for a while after the rails were gone. But you can see engine and car, they don't have any cars these days. They're going out to Epping to pick up empty loads. No outbound loads this day. And it's getting pretty bad at this point. The Portsmouth branch, the B&M wanted in the worst way to abandon the Portsmouth branch, and you can understand why. There just was not enough revenue to be made. But the customers fought like hell to keep that branch in operation. And they originally tried to abandon the branch in 1976. Didn't work. They tried again in 1979. Didn't work. The last trains would have run out to Epping and Raymond in 1980, 1981, around that area. And finally, they took a look at the track conditions, which were not FRA accepted. They were going below the FRA exception. They were going 3 miles an hour at the end on this branch. And finally, in 1982, the B&M got a permission to abandon from Page Street to Rockingham Junction, which was the majority of the branch. From Rockingham Junction to Portsmouth, it's still in use, and the B&M was still running switchers in the city itself to handle the in-city customers, but most of the country branch was gone. And you can see the conditions. This is in Auburn. This is in Hooksett Road, looking south, and you can just see the vegetation. They've got a carload of brick, carload of feed. Yep. And that was the Portsmouth branch. Yep. Now the last of the 3 Manchester branches, and probably the least photographed, was the Manchester and Lawrence branch. This was an interesting branch. For most of it, in the city, it was pretty urban, and there were a few customers. The biggest of which was probably Associated Grocers by Gold Street. Go ahead and hit again. And once the branch passed through the city, it went through what was Grenier Air Force Base, and then later Manchester Municipal Airport. Passed right through where there's a runway now, and we'll talk about that. And then got down around here in the area of Harvey Road, curved off, crossed Mammoth Road, and then went down under 93 and went down towards Derry. Now, from Manchester Yard to the airport was handled by a switcher crew. From Lawrence, Massachusetts to Londonderry was handled by a local freight. So there weren't many trains running from Manchester to Derry, or that sort of route. But in 1980, there was a horrible derailment right about here. And the Boston and Maine took a look at the track conditions, and they said, there's no customers in Wyndham. There are hardly any customers in Derry. Why are we running a local freight all the way up from Londonderry to serve these customers? So they took the section from Derry to Salem out of service and abandoned it. And they transferred the customers in Derry and Londonderry to the Concord local, the same local that served the Portsmouth branch. So the local would come down through Manchester and go to Derry. And the last time they did that was January of 1982. The branch traffic was declining. The tracks were in terrible condition. They put an engine on its side one day, and the B&M just said, that's it. We're done with Derry. We're losing money in Derry. We're going to cut the branch back to the airport, and a switcher crew can handle the rest of the customers. Now, this is the Manchester and Lawrence branch. When it left the yard, this is the yard here. This is the branch. These are the freight yard tracks, or freight depot tracks. MA Tower, the yard office. And I'm looking in the other this is looking the same direction. And this is looking in the other direction. You can see the Elm Street overpass. This track went and served Manchester Gas Company. This track came up and crossed Elm Street and serviced a couple industries on the other side of Elm Street. And this track in the foreground, right here, ran through the parking lot where Market Basket was, we talked about, and went over to West Auburn Street. And the same photo we saw before, the Portsmouth branch heading off in the distance, would have crossed Queen City Ave in the distance here, and then ran towards the airport. Now, South Manchester in this time period was nothing like it is today. It was extremely rural. There were not a lot of businesses there. This was taken at Goss Falls Road looking towards the airport. That's the famous Coas Book Trestle, which we'll see some pictures of in a minute. Some of the buildings at the airport here. But it was very rural. I mean, the mall wasn't there until the late 70s. A lot of the shopping plazas weren't there. So this is not a place that was well photographed. This is the only photograph I've ever seen of this location. And the switchers ran through here. But on this day, they had a plow train come up from Lawrence. This was in 1969. They had a real big snow in March of 1969. And they ran a plow train all the way up the branch from Lawrence to Manchester. And they're clearing the branch right here at Goss Falls. Now, to my knowledge, this and one picture taken a few seconds later by one gentleman that's here today, Dane Malcolm, are the only photos that are ever taken of a train going over this bridge. This is the Coas Brook Trestle. This, and there was an article done on the Union Leader a few years ago about this bridge. I believe John Clayton actually had a lot to do with it. And this bridge was one of the most impressive structures on the railroad in Manchester, but nobody got any pictures of it because it was in the middle of nowhere. Now it's in the middle of everywhere. It's right next to the airport, it's near the post office, it's near all the shopping plazas. Back then, you had to hike out there to get this shot. And that's what makes this shot special. Now, this train is a railroad enthusiast's passenger trip, which was started in Boston. It ran up to Manchester over the Manchester, well, it ran to Lawrence on the main line, ran on the branch to Manchester, and then went up the Portsmouth branch to Portsmouth, down to Salisbury, up to Amesbury, back to Salisbury, back to Portsmouth, back to Manchester, or back to Rockingham, and then down the main line to Boston. And you could do all of that in one day. Yeah, and you can see the branch here in the vicinity of Manchester Airport. Ran right down what's Kelly Avenue. Another shot of the local. This is after the dairy local was transferred to Concord. And you can see they're carrying road salt for the James P. Anagnos salt shed, which was in Londonderry. And this customer here is New Hampshire Plastics. They got cars and plastics. Some of the old barracks from the Air Force days. And this is the runaround track that they would have used, the switchers would have used to run around their trains. Another shot. This is taken from where the Airport Museum is, looking back towards Manchester Yard in this direction. Lawrence would have been to this direction. This is the same train as we saw just before. And this, when the railroad tracks were removed in the late 1990s, they turned this into a road. So if you drive down Kelly Avenue, that was where the railroad tracks were. Yeah, as you can see, this is taken from the steps of one of those switchers, the local switchers. Looking back, and this spur right here was one of the Air Force spurs. They got aviation fuel, they got associated supplies, they got coal for the furnaces, but not past the 50s and the early 60s. Another big customer at Manchester Airport was Silver Brothers, which was a beverage distributor. They got refrigerated boxcars as well as tanker cars of alcohol. And the switcher would have come out of Manchester Yard and gone down to the airport and served these customers. You could see they're pushing the cars into the building. They had a siding that went into the building. Cott, famous beverage company in Manchester. I don't believe you can get that anymore, unfortunately. I'd like to try it.
No.
And they're spotting the cars in the building. You can see one of the B&M brakemen talking to one of the Silver Brothers employees there. And Barry Sandel is actually driving the train at this point in time, or operating the train at this point in time.
Is that building still standing?
Yes, it's the Granite Group. No?
Oh, that's the Granite
Yep.
building?
The right-of-way went right beside it. There's a fence there, I think, now. And you can just see one of the spurs here for the Air Force Base, and all the airport facility trucks. Now this is a neat shot. Before they extended the runway, the branch ran right next to the end of the runway, and you can just see the original terminal for the airport on the other side of the runway. Now, of course, they relocated that over the runway to where it is now, but originally it was over here. And it shows you how close the vicinity was to the runway. And when trains operated on this stretch of track, they had to stop at Perimeter Road where the phone box was, call the airport dispatcher, and inform them that they would be traveling past the end of the runway, just so that no airplane crews would get spooked as a freight train carrying tankers of alcohol goes by. And this is down in Londonderry at Mammoth Road, looking towards Derry. This is right after they abandoned Manchester Airport to Derry. So 1983 is when they abandoned the airport to Derry. Well, they last operated it in 82. And they were only going as far south as the airport. And this relay box here, you see, is the only piece of railroad artifact still remaining. This has been paved as a trail. That's been repainted. And this is Harry Fry. He was a very famous railroad enthusiast. And just a couple shots of Derry, just for some flavor. This is the local coming up from Lawrence before they transferred it to Concord. They've got a tanker of gas for Pyrofax, which was at Auburn Road. Coming into Derry, and this is going back south. This is an Italian restaurant now, the old station. Now we get to the sadder stuff. Manchester in the early 1980s was really starting to show some decline. In 1983, the Boston and Maine Railroad ceased to exist as an independent company. It was purchased by Guilford Transportation Incorporation, which was a transportation conglomerate that had bought the Maine Central in 1981. They bought the Boston and Maine in 1983, and they bought the Delaware and Hudson in 1984. And the Boston and Maine at this point had been bankrupt since 1970. And they had been doing better. They had been coming out of the bankruptcy thanks to the presidency of Alan Dustin, who was a very famous Boston and Maine president. He actually just celebrated his 90th birthday yesterday. But they got approached by Guilford with an offer they just couldn't refuse. And at this point in the railroad history of the United States, it was all about mergers. In the 1980s, the Staggers Acts had just come out in 1980, which deregulated the railroad industry, removed a lot of government regulation. So they were merging left and right to try to combat the highways and combat the airplanes. So the Boston and Maine was acquired in 1983, and we'll let a video here tell the story. You might want to see if you can click on the video.
Chances are you've never heard of Guilford Transportation Industries.
Turn up.
Railroad buff would know the three northeastern systems that officially became Guilford today, and it could reverse the declining service in New England. The new company acquired the bankrupt Boston and Maine Railroad.
We'll just start this over again.
Chances are you've never heard of Guilford Transportation Industries. Railroad buff would know the three northeastern systems that officially became Guilford today, and it could reverse the declining service in New England. The new company acquired the bankrupt Boston and Maine Railroad, the ailing Delaware and Hudson line, and the Maine Central, giving Guilford 4,000 miles of track from Washington to Canada. What's more, is a privately held corporation owned by a man that holds his privacy and that of his family very dear. Timothy Mellon, heir to one of America's greatest fortunes, Mellon Bank, Gulf Oil. This is a rare photograph of him. He avoids photographers, and on the few occasions he can, makes faces to make recognition harder. Why does Mr. Mellon not want to ever be photographed? I guess he might think that I'm more attractive. The man who got Mellon interested in the railroad business. Deregulation made it possible, made chances of profit possible, says Fink. Yesterday, he took some vintage Pullman cars out of mothballs and set off on a 400-mile trip through New England, showing off the new name on the kind of terrain that hasn't been seen in this area for 25 years.
A density map here, just what Bill was talking about.
Railroad officials took some businessmen from northern New Hampshire on board, telling them how the new system would open new markets for them, and that however remote or forbidding the terrain, the freight service would still be there. As for the people in the towns along the way, just seeing a passenger train was a major event.
I'll try and throw all those two rolls of bill all right.
The Pullman cars go back in storage late tonight. The railroad business is still the freight business, but promising enough now to entice a rich man to buy a few railroads. Fred Riggs, NBC News in New England.
So this became the new symbol of the railroad in most of New England and in Manchester as well. And unfortunately, a lot of what had made the Boston and Maine such a connection to the city of Manchester started to go away during this time period. Now, not all of it can be attributed to Guilford, although quite a lot of it unfortunately can. But in honesty, the decline had really started quite a bit earlier. And even some of the Boston and Maine management of the branches and so forth, which makes a lot of sense. Just in that climate, it was very difficult for railroad companies to perform and to compete with the highways and that sort of thing. So this image that had become synonymous with Manchester for over 100 years, not at this point, but just had been associated with the railroad and with Manchester and the industry, started to go away and was replaced by what would become the new corporate image of the railroad in Manchester, Guilford. Guilford, as they had acquired quite a few railroads, quite a bit of interesting power showed up. You had Delaware and Hudson locomotives. You had Delaware and Hudson locomotives that had been repainted into the Guilford paint scheme. You had Maine Central locomotives, which otherwise would not have showed up in Manchester. And you had engines that had been repainted in the Guilford paint scheme as well. This was a main central engine, I think, originally. But it just became a mixed bag, where originally it had been just Boston and Maine solely. And you did have some engines that still appeared in the Boston and Maine paint schemes, but their numbers started to dwindle as the 1980s progressed. Now, the first big blow that came to Manchester was the closing of the Piggyback yard in 1984. This was probably, at this point in time, one of the largest customers in Manchester. It was one of the largest sources of freight revenue, and they shuttered it in 1984 and moved the operation to Charlestown, I think, in Boston, Somerville, that area. But unfortunately, it just went out, and that was one of the big customers for Manchester. Another casualty was the yard office. So with the freight business declining in Manchester, the B&M and Guildford decided it no longer needed a yard staff to handle all the freight traffic. So the yardmaster position was abolished. The clerk positions, the agent positions were eventually abolished. And they demolished the the yard office tower. And as you can see here, there it is, shuttered in 1985, closed up. And the next year, they demolished it. And all of this you see here is paperwork. Records dating back decades and decades and decades for the railroad in Manchester, for the freight business in Manchester, for engine records, for maintenance records. And a friend of mine was working in Manchester Yard when this happened, and he said you could see the paperwork flying in the breeze all over the place. Now, one of the biggest new arrivals in Manchester in this time period was the New England Southern Railroad, which was a short line railroad that had been previously operating exclusively from Concord to Lincoln on the White Mountain branch, the state-owned White Mountain branch. But in 1983, they had approached the Boston and Maine and offered to take over freight properties in Concord. And the Boston and Maine said, hell, we'll get you to Manchester. Because at this point, the Boston and Maine was not making much money running to Concord. So they said, why don't we give it to a smaller company to handle? We'll liquidate our assets and let them handle it. And by the time the decision was finalized, Guildford had come in, and New England Southern took over freight opportunities from Concord to Manchester, and they interchanged with the B&M in Manchester Yard. You can see here, South Manchester. This is Granite State Packing, meat packing plant, which is the Elliott at River's Edge at this point, or now it is anyway. But they were a big railroad customer.
That had a nice fire.
Yeah.
That burned for like 3 days.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, and here you can see New England Southern heading north at North Commercial Street, 1987, I believe. So they became the face of the railroad from Manchester north at this point. And here they are coming into Manchester with freight from Concord, and they're going to set off their cars in the Woods Yard and let the Guildford local from Nashua come up and pick them up. At this point in time, the Boston and Maine was still operating the Portsmouth branch as far as Page Street to service the customers that were on the branch. Now, freight traffic had dwindled so much in Manchester that they only needed one switcher job to handle the traffic on the two branches that were left. The Goffstown branch was already gone. So this switcher would have handled the Manchester and Lawrence branch as far as the airport, and it would have handled the Portsmouth branch as far as Page Street. Here they are in about to cross Valley Street. You can see the Agway elevator up to how are we doing on battery power? Do you know? Good. Okay. And here they are crossing Valley Street. And this was the spur that ran along Valley Street, but at this point in time, it was out of service. And one of the big customers in East Manchester left at this point was International Paper, which you can see here to the left. That's their siding. Go ahead. And they're backing the cars into International Paper along Valley Street. If you take a drive, you can still see the doors on the side of the building. They're still there. And heading light back to the yard, the brakeman getting ready to flag those umpteenth crossings. All the way back into the yard, you can see the Uncanunics there, and Hoyt Furniture. This is Mammoth Road, heading towards Page Street. And Sundin Lumber was a big railroad customer there at Mammoth Road. This is now one of the two pharmacies that's right there. But the rails were still here until 2005. They've removed them. But by the late 80s, things had started to decline. Guilford installed a surcharge on their service. So not only were they charging the companies for their business, they were charging them to use the railroad. And that was an effort to eliminate the branch traffic. Guilford didn't want any part of branch traffic. They didn't want any part of these small mom and pop companies. They didn't want any of that. They wanted long haul passenger trains, which for the era, that made, I mean, not passenger freight trains. For the area, this made a lot of sense. Because with manufacturing departing, with trucking becoming more prevalent, there just was not a lot of money to be made in branch line traffic. This is the last car to ever be spotted at International Paper in 1989, and that was the last carload to ever be spotted on the Portsmouth branch. And they had already started tearing down the Agway elevator with Elliott Hospital in the background. So by 1989, the Portsmouth branch was out of service, late 1989. It was abandoned in 1995. The only branch left was the Manchester and Lawrence branch. And this is at Manchester Airport. That's New Hampshire Plastics. You can see they were quite a high-profile customer. The locals still came down out of Manchester Yard, still crossed Queen City Ave, still went over the trestle, and came out to the airport to serve the industries here. And there they are getting ready to head back into Manchester with a car from Silver Brothers, and the rest of those are plastic hoppers from New Hampshire Plastics. That's a pretty healthy-sized train for a branch line at this point. And that's Perimeter Road up by the airport. Getting ready to cross. The trestle is just out of sight to the left, about maybe a fourth of a mile. Fortunately, they didn't get a shot of the train going over that bridge. And here it is crossing South Beach Street with the cemetery in the background. But unfortunately, bad things were in the cards for the Manchester and Lawrence branch as well. When they had started to develop South Manchester, all the development drastically changed the watershed of the area. And this was something that was familiar both to the railroad and to the companies that were doing the development. But no drainage work was ever done to correct it. And in 1989, the branch washed out just behind little Toys R Us would have been on the right here, and the car dealership that's there today. But this was where the branch ran, that's 293, and it washed right out, and the railroad never repaired it. And instead, they just abandoned the branch line from Manchester Yard to the airport. So by 1990, Manchester had lost all three of its branches, its Piggyback yard, most of their in-city customers, as well as the branch, or the main line north to Concord. So there wasn't a lot going on. One of the only mainstays left were the coal trains to Bow Power Plant. And this is some light power from the power plant. But the yard was starting to get pretty decrepit. There's the only switcher they required in Manchester. These are some cars from the branches. This is in the late 80s. And as you could see, the coal train still came through once or twice a week going north to Bow. And that was a pretty high pro. See, this is the kind of thing that Guilford was interested in, and it makes sense because it made a lot of money. The coal trains are no longer running. I believe the last one ran in 2016. So that traffic has ended as well. But as the railroad departed, the yard continually declined. This is the freight yard and the freight office. And here is the spur that would have gone up and crossed Elm Street. Very sharp curve. That was out of service by the mid-80s, and it had started to overgrow at this point. And in the late 1980s, Guilford started to pull up the Ledges yard, as there wasn't much freight traffic left in the city. And they had decided to go ahead and pull the yard tracks up as they weren't being used. I believe this was taken around 1990. And the Woods yard, this is a little bit earlier than that, still has some uses, and they still use a little bit of this yard today for the local freight that comes up once or twice a week from Nashua and goes on to Concord. New England Southern lost the lease to Concord, by the way, in 2011. Guilford, which at that point is going by Pan Am Railways, they retook the lease. And this right here was the Goffstown branch, which, as you can see, was no longer in service at this point. So as Manchester started to continually decline, we started to see recognizable aspects of the city go away. This is the yard as it looked in the mid-70s, and this is as it looked a few years ago. Of course, the ball field was a big development, and a lot of the railroad land has been redeveloped. You have condos now where the spur for the Goffstown branch would have curved towards the river. And the ball field is there now. This is the Manchester and Lawrence branch. Tracks are still in place up to Queen City Avenue, I think, but they haven't been used since the late 80s. And this is MA Tower and the yard office, and Manchester Yard and the Manchester and Lawrence branch as it looked in 1976, and as it looks today. This is the M&L branch as it curves under Elm Street, as it looked about the same time, 76, and as it looks today. And this is the freight depot there. Perimeter Road up by the airport, as it looked in 1988, right before they ended service to the airport, and as it looks today. These crossing lights are still in at Queen City Ave, and I pray that they stay in, because it's one of the only recognizable aspects of the branches in Manchester that you can still go and see today. They've never removed them. I don't know why. If anybody here knows the city of Manchester, keep them in place. This is up at Perimeter Road, where you just saw the Guilford engine crossing. And here's Queen City Ave as well. Those are the crossing lights. The branch would have run right through here, and this was a control box that switcher crews would have used to activate the lights at the crossing. They would have stopped the engine right about here. They would have activated the lights, and then they would have proceeded over the crossing. And I found this inscribed in Manchester Yard. And I thought that was pretty fitting, considering what the BMM had done for Manchester, and how recognizable it was, and how it looks today, and the fact that somebody out there remembers it is pretty remarkable. But, well, you know, most of us that go out and watch trains, we take what we can get, and they still do run freight through Manchester. The Nashua local comes up twice a week, usually once a week, sometimes twice. They do their work. You can see the tower is still there, MA Tower. The yard, this obviously, I mean, this would have been multiple tracks, but, you know, we take what we can get, especially us younger guys. Here's the yard. This, there's a siding here. This is one of the old Piggyback tracks, and they actually still use it occasionally to spot tanker cars. I haven't gotten close enough to see what they're carrying in the tanker cars, but they've got a barbed wire enclosure here for the tanker cars in the yard.
That's the gas company, I believe.
They might still do some business, yeah. And looking from Queen City Avenue, this is the Woods Yard. There are still 2 tracks left, and the local will spot cars that they don't need to take to Concord there and pick them up on the return trip. And of course, the recognizable skyline is still there, but it's grown over the years if you look. Another shot from warmer weather. Thankfully, we're in that neighborhood now. And the local going into the Woods Yard. Actually, no, they've just come through the yard, and they're backing down to Nycoa, which is one of 2 remaining customers in Manchester. Yep, there they are. So this is one of 2 customers left in Manchester, which, if you look at 1970, there were probably upwards of 50, 60, 70. Some people have said in the hundreds for customers in Manchester. It was one of the busiest cities on the Boston and Maine. But we have 2 left. There's Nycoa, and they get cars of caprolactam, and they use that for nylon manufacturing. And this used to be part of the shoe complex that was there. And the other customer that's in Manchester is down in South Manchester. Summit Packaging, used to be Sweetheart Plastics. They get plastic pellets that they use to create spray can nozzles. And here they are. The local is backing to their train after having served these 2 tracks that were here. This track on the right originally went all the way up to Brown Avenue to service more business forms. But most of us prefer, you know, most of us that watch trains, and it's quite a small community that goes out and does this, but We communicate very well, and when a train's coming through, I work at Southern New Hampshire University at South Commercial Street. A friend of mine works at Eversource at North Commercial Street. So on the Facebook groups, we'll post train going through South Commercial Street, and then 2 minutes later, train through North Commercial Street. And the guys are out there every day taking pictures, documenting what they can. And thank God they are, because if the people hadn't done it back in the days when it was really something to see, those of us that were never around to see it wouldn't have been able to view those images. But most of us prefer to remember Manchester the way it was, before we saw it, but when it was truly something to see. That's one of the switchers, an SW8 in Manchester Yard. Here we see a shot looking south, and here comes a road freight headed to Concord, and they're pulling in, and just look at the cars. Box cars of anything you can imagine. And the home signals. Yep. Phone box, yep, for calling the yard office. And it's a treasure that we have these homes too. There you can see the buildings in the background, the yard tower. And somebody decided to go ahead and chase the train up Canal Street. Coming south, they got a cab ride. There's the Woods Yard and the Goffstown branch. And it looks like some Piggyback flats here as well. Most of what you see here is gone, including the engines. Notice something about these freight cars? No graffiti.
They haven't been tagged.
This is the local that had just come down from Concord. They're getting ready to go up the Portsmouth branch to Epping. And here's a coal train coming through with some foreign power, which are locomotives that had run through from other railroads, Conrail. 1977, I believe.
What was that, about 150 cars or something?
I believe the longest train on the B&M that they had ever pulled was a coal train. I don't know what the car count for this one was, but there was quite a grade coming through Manchester Yard, so they really had to throttle up the engines. And once they got over the yard, it was downhill. This is in Candia. This is a local freight going to Epping on the branch, which originated in Manchester. Oh, still a caboose. And always away from the brakeman out the window. Probably going 5 miles an hour. This is when they were doing the relocation. And that's the same local you just saw in the video. So Manchester was a special place for trains, and I hope that as you drive through the city, as you walk through the city, as you see some of the locations that you've seen today, it's hard to notice where things were and how things happened, especially as we get further and further away. But this is not all that long ago, and most of you remember it. And if you're too young to have remembered it, there are people out there that do remember it. And there are people out there that took pictures and were there witnessing things that you'll never be able to see. And this is the way you can see it. And that's what's important about these photographs. That's what's important about the railroad to Manchester, is that no matter how much time passes, this is going to be a connection that's always going to be there. It's always going to be something that will be connected to the city, that will be connected to rail fans, that will be connected to all the companies, to the central papers, to the more business forums. You know, all these companies that are, a lot of them are still in existence. They all had connections to the railroad. They all did business with the railroad. And if you were a kid biking around, you saw trains. If you were diving off the trestle at Kelly's Falls, you saw trains. And I would hope that when you're stuck at a crossing at Granite Street, and when you're, cursing your luck for running into a train, remember how we got to where we are today, and remember how things were back then. And then maybe waiting for a train isn't the worst thing in the world. That's all I have for you today.
There might be questions.
Oh, no, of course.
Wow. Thank you, Rick. Whoa, I wish you would have gone into more detail for us. And I say that as one of those crazy kids diving off the trestle at Kelly Falls, so it was true, we did that. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm not a gambler, but I did dive off the trestle, so I guess I am a gambler. I'm guessing there might be questions for Rick, so let's not let him get away yet. Yes?
What was the purpose of putting those covered bridges on something?
Yeah, so the covered bridges were very commonplace in the 1800s. And as the 1900s progressed, they weren't as commonplace. But originally, when they were building these roads out of wood and these bridges out of wood, they didn't really have steel work yet in that capacity. So it was done as a way to protect the rails on bridges from the elements. And it's interesting if you notice, a lot of these covered bridges in the steam era didn't burn down. Well, there's a steam engine going over it. How is it not, the embers and such? But what they would do is they would employ people with buckets of water to go through the bridge after the train had passed through and put out any fires that may have started. And that bridge was lucky because it survived into the diesel era. But there was another covered bridge in Bennington, New Hampshire on the Hillsborough branch. And that burned down in 1965. And it was actually a diesel that caused it to burn down. The hot brake boxes had sparked and ignited the bridge. So these were very high-profile targets for arson and that sort of thing. But yeah, originally it was done as a way to shield the tracks from the elements and that sort of thing.
Do you know how many are left, the rail bridges?
There's only one left that I know of that you can ride through on a train, and it's at Clark's Trading Post. And that was actually relocated from Montpelier, Vermont. There are two on the Claremont and Concord branch, which is a trail now in Newport, New Hampshire. There's one in Vermont on what used to be the Lamoille County Railroad. Kentucky, yeah. There's another one on the Portsmouth branch. It's one of the more famous ones. I don't know, I forgot that one. That just got restained and repainted. But not many, and there's really not many you could ride through on a train. If the Clarks might be the only place.
How much snow had to be on the tracks in order for those?
Snowplow.
For snowplows, they used snowplows back then a lot more than they do now. I'm not really sure what the inch count would be to use a snowplow, but they used them a lot during the blizzards. They used them a lot in '69. They used them a lot in '78. A lot in '78. But over time, they ended up making a lot of engines with snowplows already built on the front, so it became less needed to run a plow train as time progressed. Anybody else? Yeah, way in the back.
This is kind of minute. On the Goffstown branch.
Yeah.
There was a branch that ran to Milford, Mass. Milford, New Hampshire, rather.
Mhm.
Identified as Grasmere Junction.
Yeah, Grasmere Junction, yep.
And I've walked the Goffstown branch several times, and I could never find where it would break off.
Right.
Do you know where it is?
Yeah, so the branch he's speaking of was called the Manchester and Milford branch. It was built in the early 1900s. It was a very redundant branch. It went from Grasmere Junction on the Goffstown branch, which at that time was the North Ware branch, and ran down through Bedford and Amherst into Milford. And that was abandoned, 24 or 26. It was real early. They realized it wasn't necessary. But Grasmere Junction was east of where the women's prison is by maybe a half a mile. You can't find it today. It's long, long gone. Even when they were running trains in the 70s, you couldn't see any trace of it.
I've done the other end of it, from Milford up to a place called Wallace Road
Mm-hmm.
in Bedford.
Yeah, you could find some of it in places, but it was replaced by the road, I think, in most places. Yeah, a lot of the times these earlier branches that were abandoned in the 30s and 40s, they just built state highways on top of them because it made sense. You know, got a right of way already. You might as well. Yep. Yeah, the WNP is another one. Yep.
All right, once again, Rick Kfoury. Now, you may have heard that Rick has authored a book that basically is part of the presentation he made here today. And as someone who knows very little about publishing books, he would love to sell you a book. And we have a table set up back with all kinds of memorabilia as well. So please patronize as you would. We would love for you to enjoy the museum since you've already paid admission. All those who raised your hand about being here for the first time, come see what you've been missing all these years, and you'll enjoy what the Millyard Museum is all about. If you enjoyed this program, next Saturday at 11 o'clock, we're going to have another author talk. The topic will be Moxie. So if you've never had a taste of Moxie, we are going to have a Moxie tasting here. Our good friends at Coca-Cola have donated 5 cases of Moxie. I don't want to be bringing it to the beach for the summer, so please come next Saturday, hear Merrill Lewis talk about his book on the history of Moxie. He's a former president of the Moxie Congress and a true authority on that very bright subject. Wear orange if you want to fit in with the rest of the crowd. So that's next Saturday, and on June 29th, we're hosting another of our incredibly successful American Girl doll tea parties. You may think you're too old for it. Your grandkids will love it, I promise you. We usually sell out, so that's June 29, and that'll be a morning event beginning at 10. And we weave historical elements through that program as well with historic dolls from the American Girl doll collection. So with that, I'm going to turn you all over to Rick and James, who is working as his cashier. If you would like to exit the museum without the crowd out back, if you go through this side entrance here and just make a left, you'll be back at the front, but I hope we'll stay and enjoy the Millyard Museum. Thank you very much for coming today.